And welcome back. In a world where thousands of youth embark on harrowing journeys across Central America and Mexico, the struggle for a better future often comes with unimaginable challenges. Drawing from extensive research and firsthand narratives of migrant youth in Los Angeles, our next guest explores the critical questions surrounding their experiences. Joining us is the leading immigration expert and author of Sin Padre and Papeles, Stephanie L. Canizales. And we thank you, Stephanie, for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Thank you. And so when we talk about this issue, obviously you're an expert, and we want to definitely pick your brain a little bit to give us a little bit more that we could really talk about here. We hear a lot across America: migration statistics, the fact of how migration is impacting the United States. Let's just break it down from your perspective, and I'll ask you, when we look at migration and the migrant crisis, how do you view it?
I view it as a legacy of US intervention in the countries where people are originating from. I study Central American and Mexican youth migration specifically. We can look back decades and see that youth migration falls on the sort of tails of young adult men who migrated, single men to work in the US, followed by women, then families, and now we're at a stage where children are migrating alone to make up for the economic losses, the political repression, the violence that they're facing in their communities, in their countries of origin. And we can tie those conditions to US policies, US economic integration in the countries where children are migrating from.
And when we look at migration, obviously there's a couple of questions that we have, and there's a couple of questions that you've even asked too. Separating children, right, or children being separated. Why do we talk about children being separated from their parents at the border without understanding why they come here in the first place?
Yeah, children are migrating on their own, right? Without parents, children are migrating with aunts, uncles, cousins. Children are also migrating as parts of a family unit, and then they become unaccompanied from their parents or caregivers at the border because of US immigration policy. We say that it is to protect children from potential trafficking. We say that it's to protect children from the potential of coming into the US with someone other than a parent or biological caregiver. Uh, all of those conditions, of course, can be true, but history shows and the research shows that this isn't the majority of the case. And young people are sort of collateral damage to any sort of deterrence policies, efforts that we make to make migration unappealing, to make life in the US unappealing. Again, kids fall as collateral damage as they're being made unaccompanied children.
Yeah, it's stuff. I think we do a lot of damage simply by just looking at the pictures that we see, reading statistics that hit the screen, and there's so much more to just the what we're seeing about, across the screen, and the statistics that we read. Putting a name to a face, putting some
Mhm.
reality there. You've been behind the scenes. Uh, Take us there.
Yeah, so my book Sin Padres ni Papeles is translates to Without Parents Nor Papers. It is a study of 6 years that I spent in Los Angeles with unaccompanied young adults and teenagers who had all arrived in the US between the ages of 7, 10, 11, and 17, right? Really young children who came to the US as unaccompanied and undocumented young people. I love your framing, right? We hear these numbers: 11 million undocumented people or 750,000 unaccompanied children. But as much as it is that very large, overwhelming number, it is also the one kid that I introduce in the introduction of the book, Christian, or Caleb, who really ushered me into what it means to be an undocumented, unaccompanied young person. They grow up as low-wage workers in factories sewing for J. Crew or Banana Republic, Old Navy. They grow up as dishwashers in our favorite restaurants across Los Angeles, as hotel janitors and domestic workers and nannies in private homes. These are young people who are coming to the US to make up again for the futures that they don't see in their origin countries, and really looking for an opportunity not just to get by, but to get ahead. And as I explain in the book, not just as immigrants, but as adolescents, as young people who are trying to imagine futures as adults and as people who can participate in their society. And that's something I think we can all empathize with because we've all been teenagers, we've all been adolescents striving to be a version of ourselves in the future.
As you did your research for your book, I wonder what were some of the key takeaways that you found that maybe defied your expectations?
Yeah, some of the things I found that were really interesting to me as a human, but also as a sociologist, right? One, that unaccompanied children are not just migrating because parents are sending them off or because children are running away from something. There were so many people that I talked to who talked in very detailed words about the mindful, methodical decisions that they made to migrate for themselves and for their own well-being, but also to support their families. They talked about wanting to end the suffering that they saw their mothers enduring, their fathers, their grandparents, but also wanting their siblings to have a future in education or in employment stability in the origin country so they wouldn't have to migrate unaccompanied. So, this idea that migrants make individual decisions to get ahead is just not true. And then the other side of that, once in the US, I was really surprised to find that when organizations, when institutions, when adults in the room let children down, they often had each other's back, right? They became each other's resources, and anyone that got any sort of insight into how to navigate a workplace or find an apartment or even just make friends was very quick to share that information with someone younger than them or someone who was more recently arrived. And youth created their own culture of care and their own networks of support in the US context in the absence of us doing that work for them.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit more about your research because you do ask some interesting questions. I think it's one question that's worth asking that I'm going to ask you. And one of the things that you ask is why are the people that are commenting on the plight of Latinos, rarely Latinos, and rarely researchers?
Why are the people that are commenting on them
Yeah.
rarely those folks? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
I think it begs to light the question like, okay, if you're getting your numbers and you're getting your statistics, how about we talk to those who are in the trenches?
yeah. I think that's one of the main issues I bring up in the book, right? If we want to solve the unaccompanied minor crisis in the US, if we want to know what's happening at the border and how to solve the border crisis, we have to ask the people that are there. We often have this sort of top down perspective on a lot of issues, not just migration, but folks that think they know how it should be and don't, as you're suggesting, know how it is, like on the ground, often have a lot of opinions on what people should or shouldn't be doing. And in that sense, we end up criminalizing, villainizing, pathologizing, right? Like making the people the problem and not really looking at the structure. So when you talk to young people on the ground, when you hear their voices, and Sin Padres ni Papeles really tries to draw on the terms that young people use, right? I don't come up with this sociological framework out of nowhere, but it's really borrowing from the language of the teenagers and young adults themselves and asking, what was the reason for your migration? What was it like to arrive initially, and how do you feel now, 10 years later? And I think when we come up with those conversations and we really understand crises from the perspective of the people experiencing them, we come away with more empathy and understanding. And that's what I was saying earlier, right? Coming away with an understanding of care, which is not something that I really went into the work expecting to find.
Yeah. As you did your research, what was your methodology and what was your approach?
Yeah, I'm an ethnographer. I spend a lot of time in community. I just watch people, and maybe that's part of my middle child syndrome where I was just like, what is everyone doing at all times in my family? But I spend time in community. I got to know a support group of young people. Again, informally, young people started their own group. It was about 15 to 30 people on any given Friday night, all unaccompanied, undocumented factory workers in downtown Los Angeles. I spent 7 months just kind of hanging out with them before anyone accepted to do an interview. I conducted 75 interviews total, all with young people who migrated as unaccompanied children, again, between about 11 and 17. And then Yeah, 6 years just going to churches, hanging out at donut shops, coffee shops, sandwich shops, any shop basically, hanging out at birthday parties and dinners, and really trying to get a sense of what does it mean? What does it look like? And how does it feel? Not that I would ever truly embody that feeling, but when you hang out enough, you sort of pick up on the threads, right, of how people experience a certain social location, the place that they occupy in society. And I was very grateful that these people trusted me enough to let me hang out, even as far as vigils and funerals of loved ones and of some of the young people that I'd come to know in the field also.
I want to ask the question about as you've taken this time in depth in the trenches, spending time. Then you look and you hear, a whole lot of policy that's being crafted from people who've never been. I call it supposition, hypothesis, all these things that are being thrown out there in order to make the migration argument. From your perspective, where are we getting it wrong when it comes to the migration argument with regards to policy that maybe we don't know because we just don't have the boots on the ground?
Yeah, one of the things that I see, just based on my own work, is that we misunderstand a lot of the time the meaning of childhood. Maybe not in the US context, but in the origin country. And I see that a lot in conversations around migrant child labor, which is on the rise, right? 318% increase in child labor violations um, over the last decade. And part of what I see is an issue in our approach to addressing that crisis, the child labor crisis, is that we misunderstand what it means to be a child in the origin countries where people are coming from. In my among my interviewees, there was someone who started working as a shoe shiner in Guatemala as young as 3 years old, and he was very aware of what he was doing to support himself, his sister, and his mother. And he comes to the US context as a 14-year-old and he starts working here. And that isn't anything different from what that person has lived or the sort of framework that that person understands their social role and their everyday responsibilities from. But it is a deviation from Western normative or US ideas of childhood. So then we come into the picture, we design policies that reward people for following a trajectory of childhood. And in the immigration world, we can think of the DREAM Act or DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, that was sort of based on this idea that a child who grew up in US schools, who experienced Americanness by everything but their legal status, is deserving of protection. But what does that mean for a young person who got here at 9 years old, who began working because that's what they knew and that's what they had to do? And they very much are productive in the sense of their own meaning of productivity and survival, but they don't meet that criteria of childhood, or they don't meet that sort of the milestones of proving their worthiness of legal protection. So again, when we sort of come into a situation from the top down and we impose our frameworks on a crisis, we miss the lived experience. And when we ask young people, well, why are you working at the age of 9 as a dishwasher in a restaurant in the US? And they say, well, I've been doing this work since I was 4, that is their framework. And we should design policies in ways that reflect the human experience, not the human expectation of what is good.
I want to get, before we wrap up our segment, the opportunity for you to talk about the role of community support and how that plays out.
Yeah, community support was perhaps the most important factor in the outcomes that I observed among young people. I explained two separate trajectories of unaccompanied, undocumented youth workers in the US. One that sort of ends, as I observed it, in a place of adaptation, adjustment to life in the US, and another one that ends at a place of perdition, which doesn't translate beautifully, but perdición in the Spanish language is a loss, an angst, a loss of self, and a loss of one's future, and the goals that you set for yourself. So the difference between experiencing adaptation and perdition for unaccompanied young people was that community support, meaningful social ties that allowed unaccompanied young people, so kids who are growing up without their parents, without an adult caregiver in the room, meaningful social ties that allowed them to feel witnessed is one thing that they describe. The witnessing, the good job, I see what you're doing, I admire the work that you're doing, which again, young people often provided for themselves over time, but also a place of desahogo, of unburdening, of venting. It's something we sort of take for granted when we grow up in families. Our parents are people, our siblings are people we vent to as children and talk about our days and our troubles. Young people don't have that when they're on their own. So, a place where they can unburden from their emotional pains, their material worries, those became really important to deciphering who ended up feeling adapted or adjusted, who ended up feeling perdition or a state of loss once in the US. So, anyone who can join a community where migrant children are being served, I encourage you to be a witness or to be a place of this ahogo of unburdening. And that makes all the difference for young people.
And so, for people who want to find out more about your book and the work that you have going on, please share with us how.
Yeah, everything I do, pretty much everything I do, can be found on stephaniecanizales.com. You can pick up the book on Amazon. And if you like what you read, I really hope that you will leave a review.
And the truth is that you've spent a lot of time out in the migration field dealing with immigration. And as we talk about this, it becomes a hotbed political issue. Do you feel as though that, and I don't want to make it too political, but do you feel as though that the candidates and even those who are in Washington simply just don't get it?
I think what I'm observing is more like a short-term memory, right? In
Okay.
the last election cycle and the one before, unaccompanied children were, a hot topic. Um, we don't hear anything about migrant children today. We hear more and more the criminalization of Haitian immigrants. It was migrant children 4 years ago, 8 years ago, as the deviant potential gang affiliated young person. So, what I wish I would see more of is a sort of full circle conversation about, if you're going to talk about something as a problem, can you provide a solution as opposed to just continually pointing out these hypothetical, straight up untrue, problems about new migrant populations and vilifying one group in one election cycle, then another group in another election cycle. So I wish there was a little bit more of a memory and a sort of loop closing effort. So that we aren't just left with this resentment towards immigrant groups as we are seeing across every single election cycle for as long as I can remember.
Yeah, a lot to pay attention to, and certainly got to have you back. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Dr. Stephanie L. Canizales, who is a leading immigration expert and the author of Sin Padres ni Papeles. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
All righty, we are taking a quick break, but guess what? We'll be back right after this.